Let's talk about clipping. Clipping is when a particular system of audio has a maximum level and the audio crosses that level. Typically, you get a red light that indicates bad things have happened. Clipping has happened. You can have clipping in the analog world on the actual preamp or console that you're using. You can have clipping as you're recording into your software. When it hits the converter, if it's too loud, that can cause clipping. And you can have clipping in the digital world when everything's in the software, but you find that you're still clipping, for example, your master output. None of these are great. At best, you can't hear the clipping, and it's just really annoying that that light keeps going off and you keep having to click it. At worst, it can cause a pretty audible, distorted, non-pleasant sound that can potentially ruin the recording or the mix. If you find that you're clipping a lot, and maybe you're a little frustrated by it. First of all, it's very normal. We've all been there, and it's easy to solve, but it requires deepening your understanding of a concept called gain staging. Gain staging just means where in the signal path is there a stage where the gain is affected? Where along this path can the volume be turned up or down? That might seem like a very simple question with a very simple answer, but as you'll see in this video, it can get pretty complicated. To demonstrate how quickly this can become pretty complicated, let's look at a simple guitar rig. So we're not even talking about recording, just an electric guitar player playing a simple rig at a live show. So first we'll start with the guitar. Where can we adjust the gain or the volume on the guitar? Well, you could say the player itself, how hard you're playing, adjusts the volume. Also, for example, on this 335, you've got two different volume knobs, one for each pickup. So there is a wide variation of volume or gain, I'm going to use those words interchangeably, just here at the guitar before we even plug something in. Then if you go into a pedal board, if you're a guitar player, you know you're constantly playing this game of gain staging things properly. With a simple drive pedal like this is one of my favorite drive pedals, you've got two settings that can adjust the volume. The gain turns up how crunchy the sound is, the overdrive. The level is the straight volume coming out. So the signal comes in over here. We adjust these two. If we crank both, then it's coming out the output very loud, which may or may not be what we want, or we can crank the gain to get it really crunchy, but we can turn down the level to make sure the output volume isn't super loud, but it has that loud cranked amp sound. Okay, we've only gone from guitar to pedal, and we already have, I think, 4 different places where we can adjust the volume. Go into the guitar amp. Obviously, which input you choose affects the volume. There's going to be at least one gain, maybe 2 volume knobs on the amp itself, and a lot of times there are EQ knobs, which to a lesser extent affect the volume as well. Then you've got your microphone. Thankfully, most mics don't have a gain on them, but they're plugged into typically a console that has lots of different options for changing the volume, increasing the gain. For example, you've got where the preamp is, and then it typically goes through, you can't quite see it here, but there could be a compressor, and there could be an EQ, and then of course there is at least one fader involved. All of these adjust the volume. So when you say something as simple as, can we turn the guitar down? That's a complicated demand because it could mean any of these things get turned down. It could be turn down the preamp at the console. It could be, hey, guitar player, turn your guitar volume down. Could be turn the pedal down. Could be turn the amp down. Could be pull the fader down. Like there's so many places where that can go wrong. That's why the idea of gain staging is so important. You have to understand all the places where it can go wrong. Then you can at least make educated decisions about which spot or spots you're going to turn things down or up to get the desired level that you want. Let's shift gears into the studio. This is a channel strip that I own. It's the PreSonus ADL 700. It's discontinued, sadly, but thankfully I have one. And if this looks really confusing to you, it's fairly simple. This is a channel strip that has several sections. So there is an input section here. This is like the preamp section. There is a compressor section here. And then there is a 4-band EQ section here, and then there is an output section or an output level there. So if we just look at this channel strip, taking nothing else into consideration, let's look at how many different ways we can adjust the volume. We can change the input impedance, which is, it's a little more advanced, but that does affect the perceived gain of the system. We can adjust the overall gain in 5-degree increments, but there's also a trim knob that goes up or down by 30 dB, so you can play with both of those to adjust how hard you're driving that preamp tube. Obviously, when you use compression, typically you have a gain knob, a makeup gain knob. So if the compressor is turning things way down, we can turn it back up and regain some of that volume that we lost. There's a 20 dB pad here, which means flip that on, everything gets turned down by 20 decibels. That's another place where we can adjust the volume. EQ, by definition, these are 4 gain knobs that can turn certain frequencies up or down. So that's going to affect the volume to a greater or lesser extent, depending on how aggressive you get with that. And then the final output level. This is the final, after it's gone through all of these gain stages, this is the final stage where we can boost it or turn it down. So maybe we drive the tubes over here and then we turn this one down. This is just on this device, right? Then I've got to take that and plug it into the input of my console, for example, which can also affect the gain like we talked about, and not to mention plugins and everything else. So even with this is I would say probably on the more complicated side of things, but you can see once you understand it, it's a fairly easy process, but there's always like a give and take of if I'm adjusting it here, then I know that it's going to affect the sound going through all these stages, and then I can adjust it back down over here or over here, over here, over here. So knowing that there are multiple places to adjust the volume is the first step towards having greater control over the volume in general and over your clipping problem. Here's an example from the mixing world. Here's a very simple session. It's got 5 guitar tracks. Those are all green. A guitar bus here in blue, and the red is our main output or our master fader. I want you to take a look at this screenshot and count up all the ways for this very first guitar track, all the ways that we can adjust the volume for that guitar track, just based on what you see here, not like theoretical ways, but what you see on the screen. How many different ways can we adjust that volume? And I want you to leave a comment with your guess, with the number. I'll come back later and reveal the answer. Pause the video now and do some counting. Back in the old days, they used to call audio engineers balance engineers, and it made sense. I'm in the studio, the Beatles are out there with an orchestra, I've got all these inputs coming to me, and I'm balancing them, oftentimes like going straight to tape. So it's probably a stressful job, but the whole goal there was to achieve balance. You had to know the gain structure, know how the gear worked to make sure everything was balanced together. That's the second step of the mixing process that I teach. So if you like to mix, but you feel like your levels are all over the place, check out my free 5-step mix guide. You'll find that in step 2, we talk about doing the static mix, which is getting all of these levels right. You get that part right, the rest of the mix process, where you start to use your plugins and your effects and all that fun stuff, goes a lot more smoothly. Now that we know there are a lot of places where the gain can be affected, we're in a better position to determine where the clipping is happening when we see clipping in our session. There's 2 different phases of that. There's the recording phase and the mixing phase. Let's talk about recording first. If you have learned how to run sound, let's say you volunteered at your church, and maybe some sound engineer told you, here's how you set levels on a microphone. You turn the mic preamp up, up, up until it clips, then you turn it down just a little bit. That may have been good advice on an old analog system that has a lot of noise, and you want to get that signal nice and loud above just the noise floor of the system. Today, in the 21st century, if we're recording to, let's say, an audio interface with a microphone input and a gain knob, the noise floor is real low. It's a completely different game. So you don't have to get it as close to clipping as possible in order to get a good sound. In fact, you will get just as good of a sound by keeping it nice and conservative versus trying to get as close as possible. If you're using an external preamp like the ADL 700, there may be a case where driving that tube really hard will give it a desirable tone. But for a lot of people, if you're just going into an interface with a standard stock preamp, you get no bonus points for going as loud as possible. In fact, a lot of those preamps get pretty noisy in that upper 20%, that top 20% of the volume. So you're actually adding more noise by cranking it up all the way, and you may not have even realized it. A better option is to, if this is clipping and this is super, super quiet, be somewhere in the middle. I like to be just maybe above 50%, because in a digital system, that still has plenty of headroom. There's no noise problems to speak of, and we're not coming anywhere close to clipping. Because what happens is you get the level and you're getting real close to clipping, but it doesn't clip and you think you're good. But what happens? A musician gets into the music and they sing and play louder than they did during sound check, and now you've got clipping. Now you've ruined the take. You got to record it again. An easy way to get rid of that stress forever is to just record at conservative levels. A common misconception is that if I record at quiet levels, my mixes will be quiet. That actually, the quiet level of your recordings has nothing to do with the volume of your mixes. We can talk about that in another video, but just know that conservative levels can still give big, huge, powerful mixes. Trust me. In fact, you can gamify this setting levels thing. It's really fun. You should try it sometime. When you're setting up to record, try leaving all your faders at 0, so at the default setting, and then adjust the volume of all the different tracks that you record with the preamp itself. So if I've recorded a guitar and a vocal, and I've got those levels feeling pretty good, if I go to record my shaker track, I'm not going to crank the preamp to the same level as the guitar and the vocals, probably. Shakers are notoriously way too loud. I'm going to need to turn that down. If that's the case, if I'm going to have to turn that down later, why not just turn it down now at the preamp? So a lot of times I'll set the levels, I'll leave the fader at 0, and I'll set the preamp level to get the right blend for the level of that track. What ends up happening if you do this, and there's some things to keep in mind to make sure you do it well, but if you do this, you'll end up with a track that sounds pretty stinking mixed without touching any faders, which puts you in a great position to start the mixing process. Speaking of mixing, the place where clipping becomes a big problem in mixing is on the main output. People play this game where they mix, and then the output clips, and then they turn everything down. Then they start mixing, and they sneak things up again. Then it clips, then they turn it back down. I played that game a lot, and I thought that's just the way mixing goes. That's just the name of the game. I'm trying to get it as loud as possible without clipping, and sometimes it clips, and I got to pull it back down. Actually, that's not the way the game needs to be played. You can keep things down at a nice conservative level without ever clipping your mix. That's why I'm so bullish on the idea of doing a static mix early. So the first thing I do in a mix, once it's set up and everything's in its proper place, as far as like putting the tracks arranged how I like them, I set the levels for everything and the panning. And one of the things I'm doing during that process, first of all, I'm not using plugins. Second of all, I'm checking the level on the main output. I'm making sure that it's not going above a certain level so that I know I've got plenty of headroom for the inevitable little bits of jump in volume that'll come when I start adding some plugins. But for the most part, my static mix is real close to the final balance of my final mix. That final mix will be more polished, but the relative levels between things like the vocals and the guitars and the drums, those decisions are made way back in the static mix. Then when I add plugins like a compressor or an EQ or any other effect into my system, I have a system that I use for making sure that I don't adjust the volume with that plugin. So if I put an EQ on a track, I want the before and after volume to be the same because I already established the right volume during my static mix. So now I'm using EQ to take out some muddiness, to boost some top end, to make it more clear, whatever I'm doing, but I want the ending result to be roughly the same volume as before. If you do that, you very rarely run into the problem where you've clipped your main output because you're adding all these plugins and adding all this volume. If you get a good static mix first and then your plugins work with that static mix instead of fighting against it, meaning the plugins respect the level that you set for that particular track, then you're good to go and clipping becomes a problem of the past. But here's the big secret. Here's the thing that people don't get. They think, okay, Joe, if I turn things down and keep things at a conservative level, it all sounds boring. It's coming out of my speakers super quiet and it doesn't sound as exciting. So I find myself almost without thinking about it, pushing things up because I want to hear it louder out of my speakers. The solution to that is so simple and people plumb forget it. Turn up your speakers. Yeah, the level of the volume of my mix in my system has zero to do with the level coming out of my speakers. Not zero, but I can crank my speakers out here in the real world without ever affecting what's happening in the mix. I'm not suggesting you should mix at stupid loud volumes, but I'm saying if you're having clipping problems, think about the gain staging thing we said before. If I'm clipping here, that means perhaps everything over here is too loud. I can either turn those things down or I can turn my speakers up. If I turn my entire mix down a few decibels and I crank my speakers up to a nice full volume, that means I can get the volume that I want for my ears, for my ear holes, and I can keep the mix at a nice conservative level that's not clipping anything. Okay, let's go back to that guitar session. Remember, we were counting up how many different ways we can adjust the volume on this green guitar track. So let's count through that together. The first, there's a gain knob input trim at the top of the channel. Then there's an EQ that will adjust the volume. There is a compressor that can adjust the volume. There's obviously the fader itself. This is feeding this bus over here, which has its own input trim. It also has its own fader. That's feeding the mix bus, which has its own fader. And if you know how audio systems work, we can actually adjust the gain of the actual clip here. There's a number of ways to do it, but we can adjust the volume here before it ever hits the mixer. How many is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. If you answered 8 to this question, you would be wrong. Why? Because you forgot I've got a knob right here that I can use to turn that guitar up and down, because I can adjust the volume of my speakers independently of what's happening inside the software. Same for my headphones. If you're mixing on headphones, it's the same principle. If that guitar is too quiet, if the overall mix is too quiet, I could either crank up all the tracks and risk clipping, or I can leave them at the conservative level and I can turn up my speakers here. Let me tell you a quick story that demonstrates this. I was engineering a session once where everyone in the band had their own little personal mixer for their own headphone mix. And I noticed as I walked around while we were getting things set up, setting levels and getting ready to start tracking, that everybody's mix was cranked. So I could see the level. It actually had like a level meter for the mix that they were listening to. Every single one of them was as loud as possible, like literally clipping on every single headphone mix. And you could tell them, hey, that's clipping, you got to turn some stuff down, but they would say, hey, but then I can't hear it very well. Why? Because they didn't have a good understanding of this idea of gain staging. They didn't realize that, I should turn all of these down, maybe way down, turn my headphones up so I've got a lot of like headroom and gain feeding into my ears. Then I can ease up the individual components of my mix to a nice, comfortable, and even loud level without any clipping. Do you see the difference? Here are the tracks. Here's the headphones. I can crank the tracks. Now this is clipping, and my headphones may be loud enough, but you'll hear the clipping sound, so it doesn't sound good. It's not fun. Or I could bring the tracks down and lift up the headphones. Headphones have headroom to them. There's a volume knob here that's taking whatever I feed it and turning it up and down. So I can keep these here with no clipping, turn my headphones up. I got nice loud volume and zero clipping. It's a simple thing. It's the same for doing in-ear mixes. If you play live and you control your own mix, a lot of people crank everything on the mix without just turning up their headphones. And that simple change transforms everything. Now, some people might say, Joe, most audio programs are 64-bit floating internal processing, which essentially means you almost can't clip the system because there's so much internal digital headroom. So you could come in, take a mix that's clipping, like crazy clipping, put just a single volume plug-in on the master fader and pull that volume down, and everything goes back to being fine and not clipping. While that can technically be true and can get you out of a pinch if you've got a mix that's got to be done, it's clipping by a couple dB, you just do that and you're good to go. You can do that, but the problem there is you lose any consistency because you're just setting levels all willy-nilly, and you just know that you can go adjust that main output volume using a gain plugin, for example, to fix the problems in your gain structure. It's not as critical as, on an analog console where there was no floating point digital internal system to make up for your mistakes, but I would still wager you will get better results if you have a consistent process for mixing. So for me, that means the master fader stays at 0. My volume knob here for my speakers stays in the same place every single time I mix, and I've got that calibrated to give me a nice, decent volume coming out of my speakers when my mix gets up to around -20, -18 average level. I've set all of that up so that when I'm mixing a song, when I push things up to a level that feels good to me, I know everything else is calibrated to where if it sounds good here, I know the levels are good there, I've got plenty of headroom, and I'm not going to clip. What does that do for me? What's the benefit of all this? Why care about clipping? Because if you have clipping, it's a symptom of not being great at gain staging, which means you're going to have a real hard time getting consistent mixes. The only way to improve your mixing is to at least get to a point where you're consistent with your mixes. They may be consistently bad in certain areas, but at least if they're consistent, you can solve the problem. But if you're constantly mixing at different levels, different volumes, using different approaches, and one day your mix is too bass heavy, the next day your mix is too harsh, you're never really going to make much progress because there's so much variation, you can't find what are the consistent points. Like in a science experiment, there are lots of controls and then minimal variables, so you can actually see what variables affect the final result. If your mix is a complete chaotic mess every time you mix and there's no consistency from one mix to the next, you're going to have a real hard time making any consistent progress. So that's why this entire video is so crucial. Get your gain staging right, get your levels right, find some consistencies, set yourself up for success by having things like the stuff we've talked about in this video, having your volume knob for your speakers at a consistent point every time you mix, and you'll find your mixes will become more consistent. And then after you have consistency, you can have improvement, and you can start to really make leaps and bounds in the quality of your music. Hey, thanks so much for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. And if you want to watch more mixing videos from me, check out this playlist. See ya.